Snow drifted down like weary feathers over the edge of the Montana frontier, soft enough to hide the broken things people carried, but not soft enough to erase them. Edna Mayfield stepped off the afternoon train with the fragile grace of someone trying to believe in a future she had never truly seen. Her boots sank into the packed white earth, and the cold bit through her traveling dress as though trying to claim her before the town ever could. She paused beneath the wooden awning, breath curling upward like a prayer too shy to rise. Around her, the small station hummed with indifference. Men unloading crates, women gathering parcels, a child tugging at a mother's shawl. No one looked directly at her, but she felt the weight of their glances anyway, the way people measure a stranger and decide whether she belongs. She pressed a gloved hand over the letter in her pocket, the one signed with elegant loops by Silas Boone, the rancher who had written to her for nearly a year. He had described wide prairies, warm fires, a home that needed a woman's touch. Edna had imagined those things during countless lonely nights, letting hope stitch itself into the torn edges of her life. But hope, she was learning, was a fragile traveler. It shivered easily, and on this winter day, it nearly slipped from her grasp entirely. Footsteps approached, heavy and impatient, crunching through the snow with the certainty of a man who believed the world arranged itself for him. Edna straightened, smoothing her coat, lifting her chin just enough to be seen without trembling. Silas Boone stopped a few paces away, his hat pulled low, his mouth a tight, uneasy line. He did not smile. He did not reach for her hand or her luggage. Instead he studied her with the thin, wavering glance of a man looking at a photograph that no longer resembled the dream he once held. His breath came out in a rough sigh, as though he wanted winter itself to deliver the words he didn't dare speak. Edna felt the truth before he said it. She sensed it in the way his shoulders slumped, in the quick dart of his eyes toward the waiting horses, in the hollow ache spreading through her chest. Still, she waited, because leaving space for hope had been her life's only luxury. Silas finally spoke, words stiff as frozen rope. He said he had not expected her to look so delicate. He said the journey must have been hard on her, that perhaps she was not suited for the rugged life he lived. Then, with a shrug that cut deeper than any insult, he admitted he had changed his mind. Another woman had written to him. Someone sturdier. Someone closer. Someone easier. The words fell like sleet against her skin, sharp, cold, unavoidable. Edna nodded, because nodding was the only thing that kept her from shattering right there on the snow-covered platform. She thanked him for his honesty. Though she tasted iron in her mouth, the taste of dignity swallowed too quickly. Silas turned and walked away without looking back. The horses carried him down the main road, leaving Edna alone with nothing but the soft sigh of the wind and the hollow space where her future had been. She gathered her carpetbag, fingers trembling, and stepped toward the town's narrow street. The snow clung to her lashes, blurring the world into white smears of cold light. She felt as though she were walking through the remnants of a dream that had already melted. A few townsfolk watched her pass. A pair of women whispered behind their mittens. A blacksmith paused mid-swing, his hammer hanging in the air. No one reached out. No one asked if she needed help. Rejection, she realized, was rarely loud. Most of the time it simply stepped aside and let you fall alone. Yet as she turned a corner, passing the last of the shops, a strange stillness met her. Not the cold. Not the wind. Something else. A presence. She felt it before she saw him. He stood near the hitching posts, towering, unmoving, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak that did little to hide the breadth of his chest or the strength in his shoulders. Snow gathered in his long dark hair and melted against the warm bronze of his skin. His eyes, deep, observing, held none of the judgment she had met all morning. They held something else entirely. Edna slowed, unsure whether to acknowledge him or slip past unnoticed, but the world seemed to hush around them. The falling snow softened, the wind gentled, and for a heartbeat she felt as though she had stepped out of her own sorrow and into a moment meant for someone braver. The man did not speak. He simply watched her, not with curiosity, but with a kind of knowing, as if he could see the small fractures beneath her composed face. His stillness was not cold. It was steady, grounding, like the earth beneath fresh snow. Edna forced herself to look away, to continue walking, because she had already been seen enough for one lifetime. Yet as she moved past him, something inside her shifted. A tiny, trembling awareness that the day's story had not ended with Silas Boone's departure. Something else had begun in the quiet space between her steps and the stranger's gaze. She took 3 steps before her resolve thinned. The wind rose, curling around her ears like a quiet urging to look back, to acknowledge the thread now woven through the cold air between them. She did not turn, but she slowed, letting her breath settle, and her sorrow soften just enough to notice why his presence felt unlike the others. There was no pity in him, no claim, a recognition, as though he understood what it meant to be set aside by those who should have offered welcome. The thought warmed her despite the cold. Snow clung to the town like a second skin the morning Edna stepped out of Mrs. Hargreaves's boarding house, still carrying the echo of yesterday's rejection inside her ribs. The air bit at her cheeks, but she welcomed the sting. It reminded her she was still here, still breathing, even if her plans had fallen apart like paper in a storm. She moved carefully down the steps, her gloved hand gliding along the rail, trying to make peace with the fact that she had nowhere certain to go. Mrs. Hargreaves had insisted she stay until she gathered her strength. The old woman's voice had been thin but warm, like a quilt patched from many winters. Edna accepted the offer not out of hope, but because she had no other path to follow, and the thought of boarding another train felt like admitting she had failed before she even began. She walked toward the heart of town, trying to memorize the rhythm of this unfamiliar place, its soft crunch of snow beneath boots, its muted colors, its distant smoke rising from chimneys. People eyed her with quiet curiosity. Some looked away quickly. Others offered polite nods. Yet none approached, as though the story of her being left behind had already woven itself through the town overnight. Their sympathy, heavy and unspoken, pressed against her shoulders. She tried to stand taller beneath it. She felt his presence before she saw him. Tawa Red Elk walked with a slow, deliberate stride, strength held in patience rather than force. His fur-lined cloak drifted behind him. Snow gathered on his bare shoulders, melting as soon as it touched the warmth of his skin. Edna stiffened, unsure why her pulse responded to him, before her mind had registered his approach. When he stopped beside her, he didn't tower so much as he anchored the world around them. His eyes, dark, steady, ancient in their calm, met hers for a brief moment that felt like a shift in the air. He asked if she needed help, his voice low, almost quiet enough to blend with the wind. She told him she was only walking, trying to understand the town that would hold her for however long fate intended. Tawa nodded slowly, as if he respected the honesty tucked inside her small answer. He told her the town was kinder than it seemed in winter, though sometimes its people forgot how to show it. Edna believed him, not because of the words, but because of the calm certainty behind them. He walked a few steps with her, not close enough to startle her, not far enough to feel dismissive. Their breaths rose into the cold air in slow, matching plumes. At the general store, a group of townsmen glanced at them with suspicion sharpened by ignorance. Edna felt the sting of their judgment, but he only lifted his chin, unbothered. She admired his composure even as a small ache formed in her chest. She understood too well what it meant to be observed, as though one did not belong. She excused herself, stepping inside to buy necessities with the little money she had left. When she emerged, the men had dispersed, leaving Tawa alone, his gaze following the drifting snow rather than their retreating backs. Edna hesitated before approaching him again, unsure if she should thank him or apologize for drawing attention. But he turned before she spoke, his expression gentle, as though sensing the tangled thoughts without needing to hear them. He told her winter revealed people's hearts. Some hardened. Some softened. Some finally told the truth they had hidden all year. She wondered which truth had pushed Silas Boone to turn away from her, and whether that truth said more about him or her. Tawa seemed to read the question in her silence. He assured her softly that worth was not measured by the weakness of another's character. She inhaled, feeling something warm settle beneath her ribs. They walked again, their steps slow. Edna learned that Tawa came into town to trade goods for his people, to escort children to the winter shelter the church provided, and to deliver medicines his tribe crafted from roots and herbs. He spoke simply, without excess. Edna listened, comforted by the steadiness of his voice. At the blacksmith's forge, Jonah Pike greeted Tawa warmly. The two men spoke briefly, exchanging mutual respect. Jonah tipped his hat to Edna, offering a kindness she had not expected. She felt her loneliness ease, just slightly, like the first crack in a long frozen river. As the morning deepened, Tawa began to turn toward the path leading out of town. Edna felt reluctance rise in her chest, though she had no claim to his company. He paused, meeting her gaze with a stillness that suggested something unspoken had taken shape between them, fragile but real. He told her that if she ever needed help, wood for the fire, supplies, guidance through storms, she could send a message through Jonah or Mrs. Hargreaves. His people, he said, did not abandon those who walked alone. Edna managed a soft thank you, though the words felt too small for the moment. She watched him walk away, each step deliberate, each breath a calm promise against the fierce cold. She realized something inside her had shifted, not with the force of hope returning, but with the gentler truth that she was not entirely invisible. But as she turned back toward the boarding house, a shadow flickered at the corner of her vision. Silas Boone stood beside the saloon doorway, his face tight, his eyes locked on her and Tawa with a darkness she had not seen before. When he noticed her looking, he stepped back into the dim interior, as if swallowing a secret he had no right to hold. And Edna, heart quickening, sensed that being seen by the man with winter in his eyes had awakened a conflict far larger than her own heartbreak. The wind whispered warning she could not yet understand. Snow thickened over the valley during the following days, layering the land in white silence so deep it seemed to swallow every whispered thought. Edna stayed mostly inside Mrs. Hargreaves's boarding house, sewing small repairs for her hostess, trying to earn her keep. Yet her mind wandered constantly to the man whose calm presence had parted the winter air like a quiet promise. Tawa Red Elk lingered in her thoughts not as a fantasy, but as a steady warmth she did not know how to name. She brushed the feeling aside, telling herself she had too little to offer anyone, let alone someone carved from strength and stillness. On the fourth morning, a knock sounded at the boarding house door, firm but respectful. Mrs. Hargreaves opened it to reveal Tawa standing beneath the porch roof, snow resting on his dark hair, a bundle of firewood balanced easily on one arm. He bowed his head slightly to the elderly woman, before asking if Edna was well. The simplicity of his concern softened the room like a lantern newly lit. Edna stepped forward from the hallway, surprised that her voice didn't tremble when she greeted him. He handed her the firewood, saying the storm would worsen before nightfall. He didn't linger, yet something restrained in his expression held her attention. She sensed he was choosing his words with unusual care. He asked, with a measured calm, if she could walk with him for a moment, only to the edge of town, where the road forked toward the river. Mrs. Hargreaves nodded her permission before Edna had gathered her composure. Edna wrapped herself in her coat and followed him out into the wind. They walked without speaking at first. Snowflakes drifted around them, catching in the fur lining of his cloak. Edna tried not to watch the way the cold failed to touch him, as though his body held a heat stronger than winter itself. He led her toward a small rise overlooking the frozen river, where the wind whispered differently, carrying the distant sound of tribal drums she could barely hear but somehow felt in her chest. Tawa finally stopped. His breath rose in steady white clouds. Edna waited, sensing the importance of what he carried in silence. He told her that he wouldn't trouble her without need. His people, he explained, faced pressure from federal agents who wished to move them deeper into the mountains before spring, claiming their winter grounds no longer belonged to them. Negotiations were growing strained, and the agents viewed Tawa suspiciously for his youth and influence. Married men, he said, carried more weight in the eyes of those officials. A wife signaled stability, cooperation, an anchor against imagined unrest. Edna frowned, unsure what his words implied. He continued carefully, saying he needed someone the agents could trust. Someone gentle, steady, someone whose presence radiated sincerity. Someone who could stand beside him during the winter council and soften the prejudice that shadowed every conversation. He paused then, meeting her eyes fully, and the world seemed to still around them. He asked if she would consider acting as his wife for the remainder of winter, only in name, only to provide his people a measure of safety. The request struck her like a gust of cold wind, stunning in its magnitude. Edna stepped back, hand pressed to her chest, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or flee. She felt the weight of her own unworthiness rise like a tide. Yesterday she had been unwanted, dismissed for being too delicate. Now she was asked to play the role of a wife to a man who seemed carved from courage. Her voice cracked as she asked why he would choose her. There were stronger women in town, women with reputations unmarred by abandonment. Tawa shook his head with slow certainty. He told her strength was not always loud. Sometimes it was the quiet steadiness of someone who kept moving through the storm, even when the world offered no shelter. He had seen how she held her dignity in the face of rejection, how she walked through town without bitterness, how she defended others with gentle truth. His people valued spirits like hers. They needed someone who reflected peace rather than pride. Edna felt her throat tighten. No one had ever spoken of her strength without twisting it into a burden. She looked at Tawa, at the unyielding sincerity in his gaze, and realized he was asking not out of convenience, but trust. A trust that frightened her for its depth. She told him she feared being a burden, feared making some mistake that could harm his people. He stepped closer, his presence warm against the wind, and said he would never place a burden on her shoulders. They would walk the path together, step by step. The river groaned beneath its frozen skin, echoing the tension inside her. She thought of the train she could take back east, the life waiting for her nowhere in particular, the endless string of disappointments she'd pretend were choices. She thought also of the firelit lodge she had glimpsed only from afar, the children who peeked around legs to hear Tawa speak, the quiet dignity of a community holding itself together through winter's cruelty. And above all, she thought of how his eyes had looked at her. Not with pity, not with possession, but with clear recognition. She inhaled deeply, tasting frost and courage. She told him yes, she would stand with him, if her presence could offer any protection. His shoulders eased, as though he had been carrying more weight than he revealed. He thanked her not with grand words, but with a quiet bow of his head that felt more intimate than any embrace. As they walked back toward town, Edna sensed the shift within her. She was no longer the woman abandoned on a train platform. She had been given purpose, a role to fill that held more meaning than anything she had known. Yet as they neared the first row of buildings, she felt an unseen tension ripple across the snow. Silas Boone stepped from the shadows beside the saloon, his eyes sharp with something darker than regret. He stared at Edna and Tawa, as though he had uncovered a secret he intended to twist for his own ends. And in that silent moment, Edna felt the first tremor of a coming storm, one she had unknowingly stepped straight into. Winter deepened its grip on the valley with a slow, deliberate breath, coating every rise and hollow in a purity that didn't match the unease growing beneath its surface. Edna followed Tawa into his people's winter lodges a few days after she agreed to stand beside him, her heart fluttering like a small bird trapped between hope and trembling uncertainty. The snow was high enough to swallow her boots at times, but he walked ahead of her, clearing the path with broad, decisive steps. His cloak brushed the edges of her vision, a shield made of fur and quiet strength. The settlement ringed the frozen meadow, like a circle of warm intentions against the cold sky. Smoke curled upward from lodge chimneys, carrying the scent of pine resin and simmering roots. Children darted between the dwellings, their laughter bright as sparks against the silence. Edna felt dozens of eyes on her, not hostile, only curious, measuring the stranger who had arrived at Tawa's side. She stood straighter, willing her breath to steady. Little Willow approached first, her small hand curling around Edna's coat sleeve with fearless trust. Edna knelt, brushing snow from the girl's braids, and received a shy smile that thawed something heavy in her chest. When Willow tugged her toward a lodge where women stirred pots of winter stew, Edna followed, surprised by the warmth that met her. The women guided her gently, teaching her which herbs soothed the coldest nights, which roots fed the hardiest hunters. Their acceptance flowed not from obligation, but from the quiet respect they held for Tawa, and by extension, the woman he had brought among them. Days settled into a rhythm both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. Edna helped prepare meals, gathered dried berries, and learned the meaning of certain gestures, when to speak, when silence held more truth than words. She noticed how Tawa moved through the camp, always calm, always watching, as though he bore the responsibility of every life nestled within those winter lodges. His presence filled spaces without dominating them. Even the smallest children seemed steadier when he stood nearby. Edna found herself observing him more than she intended. The curve of his shoulders as he bent to repair a spear. The way his breath fogged the air as he greeted dawn alone at the ridge. The quiet patience in his voice whenever he spoke to the elders. She tried to dismiss the ripple of warmth that stirred inside her whenever he looked her way, reminding herself she was only a helper, a stand-in wife, a borrowed thread stitched into a larger cloth she did not belong to. But each passing day made that truth more difficult to hold. One evening, a storm approached with a growl beneath the horizon. The sky darkened early, pulling deep shadows over the snow. Edna helped secure the lodge flaps while Tawa checked every fire pit, ensuring no spark could escape into the wind. Inside the main lodge, the fire crackled with earthy fragrance. Edna worked beside him, their hands brushing as they arranged the logs. The moment their skin touched, she felt it. An electric warmth, gentle yet potent, like a whisper from a world she had not yet dared to imagine. She withdrew quickly, embarrassed, but Tawa's eyes softened, not with amusement, but with understanding so complete it nearly unraveled her composure. He shifted the firewood, careful and deliberate, giving her space without stepping away completely. His presence felt like a shelter she could lean against without fear of collapsing. When the storm finally broke, the wind roared across the valley, shaking the lodge walls with icy fists. Edna lay awake long after the others slept, listening to the howl outside. Memories pressed against her. Nights back east spent waiting for a future that never took shape, the sting of being unwanted on the train platform, the cold silence of a life without purpose. She curled deeper into her blanket, trying to quiet the ache in her throat. A whispered rustle sounded near the lodge entrance. She looked up to see Tawa crouched beside the doorway, his silhouette etched by the glow of the dying fire. He spoke softly, asking if the storm frightened her. She answered honestly. It wasn't the storm outside, but the one inside her that kept sleep away. He listened without interrupting, his posture steady, his gaze gentle. He told her storms were not signs of weakness. They were reminders that the heart was trying to grow, even when the world felt too harsh for new roots. His words broke something open. Edna felt tears gather, hot and humiliating, but she could not force them back. She turned her face away, ashamed. But Tawa moved closer, not touching her, only offering the warmth of his nearness, the reassurance of a man who understood brokenness without needing it explained. She let the tears fall silently, letting them trace the path of the fears she had carried too long. When her breathing slowed, he draped an extra fur around her shoulders, his hands lingering with a tenderness that tensed her heart in bewildering ways. The storm passed by morning, leaving drifts piled high against the lodge walls. Edna stepped outside into a world remade, glittering beneath the weak winter sun. She felt lighter, though she couldn't name the exact reason. Perhaps it was the conversation. Perhaps the quiet comfort of Tawa's presence. Perhaps the realization that she was no longer alone among strangers. But not every shift in winter was gentle. 2 days later, word spread that federal agents had arrived in town earlier than expected, carrying stern expressions and colder intentions. Tawa's people gathered, anxiety simmering like a low fire. Preparations for the negotiation accelerated. Edna felt the weight of her role settle onto her shoulders, heavier now that she understood what was at stake. She tried to reassure herself she could offer something meaningful, but doubt coiled inside her like a tightening rope. That evening Tawa found her near the riverbank, gathering her thoughts beside the ice. He stood beside her for a long moment before speaking. His voice held a strain she had not heard before. He told her the agents were looking for any excuse to discredit their agreement. Any misstep, hers or his, could fracture everything they were trying to hold together. Edna's heart stuttered. She asked if he regretted choosing her. His answer came swiftly, solid as earth. Never. Not once. But the path ahead would be difficult, and he feared the storm she was walking into. She looked at him then, really looked, seeing not only the leader he was but the man beneath the calm exterior, a man carrying the future of his people in hands that had never asked for rest. The wind tugged at his hair, brushing a strand across his cheek. Impulsively, before she could question herself, Edna reached up and gently moved it aside. His breath caught. Just for a moment. just long enough to shift the air between them. Before either could speak, distant hooves echoed across the frozen ground. Edna turned toward the sound, and her pulse clamped tight. Silas Boone rode toward the settlement, face rigid with purpose, eyes locked on her with a hunger sharpened by wounded pride. One look told her he wasn't here to apologize. He had come with something far more dangerous. A storm pressed against the valley with a restless hunger, gathering in the bruised sky long before the first snowflake fell. Edna felt its weight long before she heard the wind. It sat behind every breath she took that morning, curled in the space between her ribs like a whispered warning she couldn't name. Tawa stood near the lodge entrance, speaking quietly with two elders, but his eyes flicked toward the horizon again and again, as if trying to read a language only he understood. The tensions with the federal agents had already tightened the air. Now the approaching storm wound it further, coiling everything into a single thread ready to snap. Silas Boone had left as suddenly as he'd arrived 2 days prior, but his presence had lingered behind like the smell of smoke after a fire. Edna sensed he had not come merely to reclaim what he once discarded. His gaze that day had carried something sharp, something capable of cutting through more than just pride. She avoided the thought as best she could, choosing instead to focus on her role. Standing with Tawa, facing the agents as the woman he had chosen to present as his wife, the steady voice meant to soften their suspicion. But each hour that passed made the unease more difficult to silence. By midday, the agents reached the settlement. Their horses snorted steam into the cold air, their coats speckled with early flakes. The lead agent, a broad-shouldered man with a trimmed mustache and a rigid jaw, surveyed the camp as though memorizing the details of something he intended to dismantle. Deputy Miller rode beside him, hungry for approval, his gaze flicking from Tawa to Edna with thinly veiled contempt. Tawa stepped forward and greeted them with a composure that seemed almost carved. Edna stood slightly behind him, exactly as he'd instructed, a position of respect, yet undeniable presence. The agent's eyes narrowed at her, calculating, measuring. He asked why she was there. Tawa answered simply that she was his wife, and therefore part of any discussion about the future of their shared home. Edna kept her chin lifted, steadying her breath, reminding herself she was not lying. She was offering her courage, her dignity, her belief that peace was possible. The agent questioned Tawa at length, about hunting grounds, migration patterns, winter shelters, even the tribal school that missionaries supported. Each question carried an edge sharpened by mistrust. Edna felt the weight of Tawa's restraint in every word he spoke, the careful shaping of his replies, the disciplined calm he maintained even when the agent's tone dipped toward accusation. Yet through it all, she sensed Tawa drawing strength from her nearness, from the silent assurance standing beside him gave. But Deputy Miller was not as subtle. When he stepped forward, he looked at Edna with satisfaction twisted in his eyes. He claimed he had reason to believe that Edna was not Tawa's wife at all. He spoke of seeing her arrive in town alone, of hearing whispers at the saloon that she had been abandoned, of knowing her name had once been tied to Silas Boone's correspondence. He sowed doubt with smooth, poisonous strokes, each one chipping away at the fragile trust Edna and Tawa had built with the agent. The agent's gaze flicked between them, suspicion rising like frost. Tawa's jaw tightened, but Edna felt his restraint trembling beneath the surface. She knew a single spark could turn the negotiation into a blaze neither side could control. Before the silence thickened enough to choke them, Edna stepped forward. She told the agent that men sometimes left women behind without reason. That she had not chosen that fate. That she had chosen this one, this man, this people, this winter. Her voice wavered once, but steadied as she spoke. The truth of her words wrapped around her like a mantle she finally claimed. She told them that Tawa's people had shown her more honor in a single week than she had known in years. The agent's expression flickered, a crack in his rigid sternness. But just as the ground under them seemed to shift toward possibility, the wind changed. Edna heard the crunch of snow from the direction of the tree line, and turned to see Silas Boone riding toward them once more, face set in a grim line. He dismounted quickly, tossing his reins as though eager to thrust himself into the middle of the gathering storm. He shouted her name, the sound sharp enough to slice through the moment's fragile calm. Silas strode forward and declared that Edna belonged with him, that she had been meant to marry him, that she had run to hide her humiliation. Edna froze. Tawa stepped between them with a movement so subtle, and yet so absolute that it felt like the earth itself had shifted. Silas's eyes burned with the conviction of a man who could not stand the idea of being replaced, even by someone he had once dismissed coldly. He demanded Edna be removed from the negotiations entirely, claiming she was being manipulated for political gain. The agent's suspicion reawakened instantly. Deputy Miller smirked, emboldened. The air crackled with danger as the wind intensified, pulling loose snow into spiraling eddies around their feet. Edna felt her heartbeat hammering against her ribs, pressing upward like a trapped bird desperate for escape. Then Tawa spoke, calm, clear, unyielding. He told Silas that Edna was free to choose her own path, and she had chosen to stand with him. His voice carried no anger, only truth. But Silas lunged forward anyway, grabbing Edna's arm with a desperate, bruising grip. The world narrowed. Tawa's hand shot out, wrenching Silas's fingers away with a force that left no doubt of his strength. The agent stepped back, startled by the sudden escalation. Before more words could explode, the storm finally broke. Wind screamed through the valley, hurling sheets of snow sideways. Horses reared. Agents shouted. The sky dimmed into a swirling chaos of white and shadow. Tawa grabbed Edna's hand and pulled her away from the melee, guiding her toward a rocky overhang at the edge of the settlement. Snow stung her face like icy needles, but he shielded her with his body, clearing a path through the blinding gusts. Beneath the shelter of the cliff, the storm became a muffled roar, distant yet insistent, like an angry spirit pounding at the door. Edna pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing breath. Tawa remained close, scanning the storm for signs of danger. Snow clung to his hair, melted on his skin, traced the lines of his shoulders. The stormlight flickered against him like fire trapped in ice. Edna had never seen him look so fierce, so alive, so breakable beneath the weight of everything he carried. She spoke his name softly, worried for him, for all of them. He turned to her then, and something unguarded slipped through his usually composed expression. A tremor, slight but unmistakable, ran through him. He stepped closer until the warmth of his breath mingled with hers. He told her he had tried to keep his heart steady, tried to treat this agreement as nothing more than duty. He had told himself she was temporary, a help offered by fate for a single season. But every day had become a thread binding them, soft and inevitable. Every quiet word she spoke wove itself into his thoughts. Every moment she stood beside him steadied a part of him he had never admitted needed steadying. He told her he had fallen, slowly, deeply, without permission. Edna's breath caught, her entire world narrowing to the space between them. Snow tumbled past in frantic swirls, but inside the shelter everything felt impossibly still. Tawa lifted a hand, hovering just shy of her cheek, waiting for the smallest sign. Edna leaned into the warmth of his palm, with a trembling certainty she had never known before. His touch was gentle, reverent, as though she were something fragile yet sacred, something he feared might vanish with the next gust of wind. He told her he loved her. Not as a necessity, not as a shield, but as the woman who had walked into his people's winter, and brought a light he had not expected. A light that reached the parts of him he had kept buried under years of responsibility and restraint. The confession shook him. She could hear it in the slight break in his voice, the quiet vulnerability beneath the words. Tears warmed Edna's eyes despite the cold. She reached up, her fingers brushing the edge of his jaw, grounding herself in the presence of the man who had seen her when no one else had looked past her quiet exterior. She told him she had spent her life believing she was easy to discard, easy to forget. But with him, she felt chosen, not out of convenience or obligation, but because something in their souls recognized each other across the breaking winter. The storm howled, but in the small space between their breaths, a different kind of thunder gathered. Their lips met softly, not with urgency, but with a deep, unspoken promise. The kiss unfolded like a long-exhaled truth, slow and steady, carrying the warmth of a fire stoked patiently through the coldest night. His arms wrapped around her, drawing her closer, anchoring her as the world outside shook itself apart. When they finally pulled back, the storm had begun to ease, its rage exhausting into scattered gusts. Tawa brushed a strand of hair from Edna's face, his thumb lingering with a tenderness that softened even the fiercest edges of his strength. She felt a shift, subtle, immense, settle into place around them. But as they stepped out from beneath the overhang, ready to return to the town and face whatever consequences awaited, a single figure emerged through the thinning snow. Silas Boone, eyes narrowed, expression twisted with something far beyond jealousy. He had not retreated. He had not given up. He had been waiting in the storm for them to return.